Okay, so in the next hour and a quarter or so, we want to extend our discussion of the Pentateuch out to include Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, which is one coherent set of texts, and then we also need to address Deuteronomy and touch on the Deuteronomic history. So what's going on there, of course, is that we talk about the Pentateuch, the 5 books, but particularly the way they're addressed in modern scholarship, we tend to deal separately with Genesis, which has its own characteristic set of issues and dynamics and so on. Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers tends to be hang together, cohere in a literary, theological sense. And then Deuteronomy, which kind of picks up the story and retells it with a particular twist, is typically seen by critical scholars as actually the first part of another literary set that extends through Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. However, that wonderful insight, which I'm sure is absolutely correct, was only made about 100 years ago. So, the way the texts have been received and experienced in both the synagogue and the church is as the Pentateuch, as the Torah, as a set of 5. But in terms of the world behind the text, scholars tend to see Deuteronomy as the beginning of a larger set of material, and of course part of all that is actually to understand Genesis through 2 Kings as at another level, not a canonical level. Genesis through Kings is also a literary and theological unity, but that is not reflected in the canonical shape of the Old Testament, of the Tanakh. Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings in the Jewish canon is part of the prophets, the former prophets. But from a modern critical perspective, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings makes up one self-contained, coherent entity called the Deuteronomistic history. And Genesis through to Kings is sometimes called the primary history, or the great history of the Jewish people from Genesis to Kings. But as sacred text, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings is seen as prophetic literature, and the Torah took preeminence as the 5 scrolls of Moses. So there's a kind of reception history going on there which changes the way things have worked. So it's actually quite a challenge to try and do a Torah in half a day, and Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers in the hour after lunch, and also throw in Deuteronomy as well. But I'm sure you're up to it. You're a bright bunch. So we use the same kind of format. We'll start by looking at issues from the world behind the text, then we'll look at the world of the text, and then we'll conclude by looking at how we might read those texts in our world. So again, we'll be looking at things like textual criticism, form criticism, source criticism, redaction criticism, and the historical social sciences. And all of these processes or tools are called historical critical method, because they're forms of historical criticism. They focus on the world behind the text. So basically the textual data for the rest of the Pentateuch will be the same as the textual data for the book of Genesis, except as we've noted, it's a little bit stronger once you get to the Aleppo, because it does have some part of Deuteronomy and so on. So there's a little bit of variation. In the case of the Qumran data, there are 18 manuscripts of Exodus. Now these are not always the whole of Exodus, but Exodus is represented in part on 18 different manuscripts, 17 copies of Leviticus, and 11 copies of Numbers. Now bearing in mind, as best we can tell, the community who owned and used these scrolls and hid them in the caves when the Roman 10th Legion was approaching in 68 CE, was a priestly community in self-imposed exile from the temple. So they're going to have a particular interest in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, because this is their stuff, how to do religion properly. Okay? And equally, Deuteronomy, 33 copies of Deuteronomy. Okay? It's the second most common book of the Old Testament found at Qumran. Anybody got a suggestion as to why Deuteronomy might have particularly resonated with the the community at Qumran. Purity laws, although that's more Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, but you're on it's in that paddock. Yeah, no, that's not quite the line. It's not quite the line. The storyline in in Deuteronomy is that Israel is out in the wilderness, and they're poised because they're just about to go in and take possession of the promised land. So the priests that have gone into self-imposed exile down by the Dead Sea put themselves into the wilderness and are waiting till the moment is ready to come back and reclaim the promised land and do it properly. So I think the Deuteronomy thing resonates with the Qumran Essene experience. The other book which is quoted, which survives more often than Deuteronomy amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls, is the Psalter, the Psalms, and that's the temple hymn book. So again, that reflects their priestly interest in what's happening at the temple. Interestingly, and the other one, which I think features very strongly at Qumran, is Isaiah. In fact, it is Isaiah. Now, as an aside, the three parts of the Old Testament which are quoted most often in the New Testament are Deuteronomy, the Psalms, and Isaiah. Okay? So whatever differences there were between Jesus and the Qumran people, they were representatives of a mindset within Judaism that particularly drew on Deuteronomy, Psalms, and Isaiah for its spiritual inspiration. So there's something else going on there as well in the way that they're using the Old Testament. Okay? So it's interesting. Here we have texts like Song of Songs and Esther, which there is not a single scrap at Qumran, and then we have 33 copies of Deuteronomy and 18 copies of Exodus and so on. So we can see their favourite reading as a group of grumpy priests who didn't like the way the temple was being run because they changed the prayer book. Okay. Now, just putting this up again to remind us that we're going to be looking primarily at Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and then a short look at Deuteronomy. So overwhelmingly, the source critical data relevant to these books is going to be priestly and then Deuteronomistic. Okay? And I'll say a bit more in a moment about standing back from JEDP, but that's the overwhelming traditional position on the source criticism of the Pentateuch. Okay, so P material, priestly material, interest in temple, in ordination, in rituals, in robes, in vestments, all the stuff that gets people excited around here, lace and candles and stuff. That's what you'll find them into in Exodus, all of Leviticus, and the first half of Numbers. Of course, the Deuteronomic material dominates Deuteronomy. There's a nice alliteration, because that is where it comes from. That's the essence of that material. And a little bit of both J and E material will be found in other parts of Exodus and Numbers. Now, as a way of getting into this, I want us to look at the three different versions of the Ten Commandments. So now I'm going to mess with your heads. Okay, it's not that there are 30 commandments, but there are three different versions of the Ten Commandments in the Torah, and they are not the same as each other. Okay, so which deal do you want? Kind of. Okay. So the sort of classic version of the Decalogue is the version in Exodus 20. That's Moses, Mount Sinai, people gathered around, they've just got out of Egypt, and so on. This is the famous edition. Now, this has got to be relatively small print to put it up, so I apologise for that, but I just want us to get a sense of how this familiar text looks. And just don't worry about reading individual words here, but just get a sense of the weight of how many words. So think about essay word length, and you had to choose how many words to spend on the introduction, the body, developing this point, developing that point. Apply that word budget strategy to the Ten Commandments. Okay? And God spoke all these words, I am the Lord your God, brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself, so that's presumably number one. You shall not make yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or in the earth beneath, or in the water under the sea. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of parents, to the third and fourth generation of those who reject me. Do not mess with me. That's what's being said there, really. But showing steadfast love to the thousandth generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. Okay? I want to be surrounded by yes men. You shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not acquit anyone who misuses his name. 4. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labour, do all your work, but the 7th day is the Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son, your daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, but rested the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. So this, if you like, is an intertextual reference to Genesis chapter 1. Whoever wrote this had read Genesis chapter 1, or knew the tradition that we have in Genesis chapter 1. Honour your father and mother, so your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not covet your neighbour's house, you shall not covet your neighbour's wife, or male or female slave, or ox or donkey, or anything else that belongs to your neighbour. Okay, girls feel really special at a time like this. You're one of the chattels. Okay, so that's the version we find in Exodus 20, and that's sort of the familiar version. You notice the commandments are given quite disparate weights. You know, murder, adultery, stealing, bearing false witness are basically one-liners. In fact, in Hebrew, they're effectively one word. Okay? No stealing, no murdering, and the no is like hyphenated, and it's part of the one word. So it's just like, you know, no to stealing, no to adultery, no to murder, no to whatever. But others are elaborated, and particular theological explanations are given, and particular blessings and curses are attached to that particular requirement, but not to the other. So it appears that God is more upset about us using God's name wrongly than he is about murdering, adultering, or stealing, for which there are no particular sanctions other than don't do it. Now, of course, that's not a legitimate exegesis. I'm just saying the way the word count has been allocated, a lot more attention is being given to certain things. So they must be the things that mattered for the person shaping this tradition. Now we fast forward to chapter 34. Exodus 34. This is part of the story where Moses has previously finally come back down the mountain after 40 days and 40 nights, which is a good time to do anything in the Old Testament. And he hears them having a party, and they're dancing around the golden calf, and he has a hissy fit, and he throws the 10 Commandments on the ground and smashes them, the 2 tablets of stone. Not a good look for a prophet to do that with the laws God has written with God's own finger. Okay? This is like bad career move for a prophet, one would think. So eventually he goes back up the mountain. God says, come on, come back up here, Moshe, and I will write it out again. He's very patient, unlike some lecturers. So it's like, sorry God, the dog ate my essay, you know. No, it's not that big, not that big. Depends which hill it was. So he wasn't young either. He was, 120 or something. Obviously didn't have asthma. So in the beginning, I haven't tried to quote the whole context, but actually says a verse or two before this, and God wrote these words with his own finger. So this is and they are exactly the same words as what God wrote back in chapter 20. This is absolute alignment, except the words are not the same. Oops. Okay. So historicity and facticity is an element of a different order of magnitude for the ancient storyteller than it is for the modern reader. Their version of what the same is is not identical to ours. So observe what I command you today. See, I will drive out before you the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Take care not to make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land to which you are going, in other words, no peace treaty with the Palestinians, or it will become a snare among you. You shall tear down their altars, break their pillars, cut down the sacred poles, for you shall worship no other God, because the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. You shall not make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, for when they prostitute themselves to their gods and sacrifice to the gods, someone among them will invite you, and you will eat of the sacrifice, and you will take wives from among their daughters for your sons, and their daughters who prostitute themselves to their gods will make your sons also prostitute themselves to their gods. This person is not into multi-faith dialogue, okay? You've got a very strict view on who's in and who's out. Okay? It also sounds nothing like the opening of the Ten Commandments in Exodus 20. You shall not make cast idols. You shall keep the festival of unleavened bread. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread as I commanded you at the time appointed in the month of Aviv, for in the month of Aviv you came out of Egypt. So keep Passover. All that first opens the womb is mine. All your male livestock, the firstborn of cow and sheep, the firstborn of a donkey you shall redeem with a lamb, or if you not redeem it, you shall break its neck. And all the firstborn of your sons you shall redeem. Okay? So, if it's a cow or a sheep, you sacrifice it to God. If it's a donkey, or they're actually worth a bit too much to give to God, so we'll substitute a lamb. And if it's a human baby boy, we redeem it. We redeem him. Okay? Donkeys are. Donkeys and people. Yeah. Well. Yeah. So you should redeem a donkey. You can redeem a donkey with a lamb. If you're not willing to, then you kill it. It's mine. But you're not allowed to kill your son. Okay? No one shall appear before me empty-handed. You will use offering envelopes. Thank you. Sign up for the pledge. 6 days shall you work, but on the 7th day you shall rest. Even in ploughing time and in harvest time you shall rest. You shall observe the festival of weeks, the first fruits of wheat harvest, and the festival in gathering at the turn of the year. 3 times in the year all your males shall appear before the Lord your God, the God of Israel. For I will cast out the nations before you and enlarge your borders. No one shall covet your land when you go up to appear before the Lord your God. Okay, it's going to be okay. Sending all the able-bodied men up to Jerusalem 3 times a year will not make you vulnerable to incursions by your neighbours. So they must have had that problem, or at least worried about that problem, in order to mention it. You shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice with leaven, and the sacrifice of the festival of Passover shall not be left until the morning. The best of the first fruits of your ground you shall bring to the house of the Lord your God, because the priests like fresh veggies. You shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk, just in case you're ever tempted. And then at the end, the Lord said to Moses, write these words. In accordance with these words, I have made a covenant with you and with Israel. He was there with the Lord 40 days and 40 nights. He neither ate bread nor drank water, and he wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, the 10 Commandments. Okay, Devarim Asherah. And that's where the phrase 10 Commandments comes from, this chapter. They're not called the 10 Commandments in chapter 20. They're not called the 10 Commandments in Deuteronomy 5. They are called the 10 Commandments here. And there are 10 of them. But they're not the same 10. Alright? Meanwhile, in Deuteronomy chapter 5, we get the D version of the 10 Commandments. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything in the heavens above. That's much the same. Okay. You shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not acquit anyone who misuses his name. Observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy, okay, as your Lord commanded you. Now, not because of creation, but because of Exodus. Okay, why are you doing this? Well, the 7th day is a Shabbat to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son, your donkey, your male, female slave, your ox, your donkey, any of your livestock, or the resident alien, so that male and female slaves may rest as well as you do. Remember, you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. That's not the reason for keeping the Sabbath day in Exodus 20. So it's a different theological rationale. And it's a very nice rationale. Slaves get a day off as well, and never forget you were slaves once. Yeah, never forget. Honour your father and mother as the Lord has commanded, so your days may be long, and it may go well with you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder, neither shall you commit adultery, neither shall you steal, neither shall you bear false witness, neither shall you covet your neighbour's wife, neither shall you desire your neighbour's house or field, or male or female slave, or ox or donkey, or anything else that belongs to your neighbour. So at least the wife has come up to the top of the list and is more important than the house or the donkey. Okay? So we've got three versions of what claim to be the Ten Commandments. Okay? So did God muff his lines? Yeah, what's going on here? So the source critics go to work, and they assign these collections of traditional material to different sources within the ancient processes of Israel handing stuff on. And I mean, the one in Deuteronomy is clearly sort of Deuteronomic. It reflects some of that language, and it talks about, it refers to the loving God and not simply being scared of God. The Exodus 34 Decalogue is actually much more interested in liturgical and priestly matters, and presumably comes out of a priestly context.
The second one.
Yeah.
Now, you're reading then which one would you choose, would you follow God in fire records? The second one is all crap. It's quite scary.
Yeah. And the first one is,
It's getting there.
I mean, it obviously knows the Genesis 1 tradition, which tends to be seen as a priestly tradition, and yet so what's the link between chapter 20 and chapter 34? Are they both priestly? Is one of them J, the other one P, or are we just using the wrong categories? The point is we have three different versions of the Decalogue, and in the case of Deuteronomy and Exodus 20, they're very, very close, but with a couple of new theological explanations and so on that are significantly different. So these are traditions which are being processed and received and implemented and passed on in slightly different ways. And all three of them sit within the context of the Pentateuch as this is the version of the Ten Commandments. Now, part of that is technology. No one in the ancient world carried a scroll, 5 scrolls, around in their back pocket and said, I'll just look that up and check that you've got the right version. So documentation didn't function in the same way that documentation does for us. There was no Command F, no Control F.
But even now, look how many versions of everything we have online and how much
confusion there is. So. And indeed, if we were looking even more closely at the Decalogue, even say Exodus 20, there are 11 commandments in Exodus 20, but we all know there have to be 10. So Catholics, Protestants and Jews break them up differently in order to get 10. Because we never notice that, because we only ever see it our way. We only ever see it broken up in our way. But when you stand back and look at how the wider tradition, ecumenical and interfaith, has received even just Exodus 20, we've basically got, and use the old language, 5 for God, 5 for man, 5 for us, whatever, 5 for neighbour, and in the middle is the extra commandment, honour your mother and father. There are 5 commandments about doing the right thing by God, there are 5 commandments about doing the right thing by your neighbour, and there's this other one that kind of snuck its way into the tent, and it really matters to the people passing on the tradition, is be nice to the old people. Honour your parents, and you're not going to throw that out. So it kind of, once it's wriggled in, it never gets dropped from the list. Okay, but even when Jesus summarises the commandments, what does he summarise it down to? Love God, love your neighbour. And that's exactly what we actually have in the the first half of the Decalogue is predominantly obligations to God, and there are 5 of them, and then there are 6 commandments about your neighbour, or 5 about your neighbour, and then there's the one about your parent. Honour your mother and father. Okay, so we can see where source criticism is not necessarily coming up with an answer as to where did that source come from, but at least recognising that there are earlier versions that are being picked up and recycled and preserved, and had they not been, they would have just disappeared from our cultural history. Then when we look at issues of form criticism, we can see that, especially within Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, legal material is going to dominate, and we're going to find a mix of laws for the community, like don't move your neighbour's boundary peg. Okay, neighbourhood disputes were there in the ancient world as much as in the modern world, and then of course religious laws, how to prepare certain sacrifices and so on. The laws tend to be of 2 types. So we have apodictic law and case law. Apodictic law is you shall not. Don't do it. Case law is if you have an ox and your ox falls on the well and it's a Sabbath day, then it is okay to get some neighbours and pull him out, because ox is really valuable. You can't lose that asset, and you don't want the well being wrecked by a dead animal. Okay, so that's case law, whereas the sort of the apodictic law is more I'm in charge, I'm the boss, and I'm telling you how it's going to be. So I'm laying down the conditions of the covenant, and they come from 2 different theological and historical frameworks. The context for the apodictic law is in fact the covenant treaty or the suzerain treaty genre, which was the international covenant that was particularly significant during the Iron Age period of Israel and Judah, where an Egyptian king or a Assyrian king or a Babylonian king would cut a deal with his vassal, which would, and basically the 10 Commandments and the historical prologue and so on reflect pretty well exactly the genre of an ancient treaty document. You begin by setting out who the parties of the covenant are. I am the divine Pharaoh who rules from sunrise to sunset, and I look after my people and give them harvest, and and then you shall have no other master but me, and then these are the obligations of the covenant, and if you keep the covenant you'll be blessed, and I will look after you and protect you from those nasty enemies across the river, and if you break faith with me and go chasing off after other kings, I will wipe the earth with your nose, kind of thing. Okay, or variations on the theme. So these are the way that Israel is articulating its relationship with Yahweh is by using traditional forms of communication which were known from the public sphere. Okay, and they're talking about God as if God were a political power who has laid down a covenant, a treaty obligation.
Would any of those other laws come first before the ones in Exodus? You know how you were saying about the other king's names? I've read some in the Ankara Museum.
Yeah.
Would any of them predated, or is that not yet?
Oh, no, well, I think you're talking about the Code of Hammurabi and so on. There are...
Yeah, and there's a couple of others around
yeah.
Similar.
Yeah. There are ancient law codes which are 1,000 years or more earlier than the time of Moses.
But they're all in a similar vein of...
Yeah, and so partly what we're dealing with is the common cultural inheritance of the ancient Near East. And people like Hammurabi and so on, what does he do? He goes up a mountain and his God gives him the law. He comes down and proclaims the law to his people, and they carve it on a stone, a stela, which you can now find in the Louvre. But yeah, it's that kind of... Now the Moses story is playing into that expectation. That that's how a God sets up a covenant relationship, and the law that we live by is anchored in our God. It's not simply anchored in the king. And of course that gets reflected in European and British and Australian law by people talking about how the our public law codes are anchored in the Judeo-Christian scriptures. And it's that same kind of claim, that underneath our laws passed by Parliament are God's laws. It's that same kind of ancient Middle Eastern concept. So the Hammurabi codes tend to be case law, whereas the apodictic law is more typical of the treaty, which is more a first millennium political form rather than a second millennium political form, as in second millennium BC. And then we also find the sermon or the speech, and this is particularly true, of course, of Deuteronomy. Indeed, the whole of Deuteronomy is a series of sermons. And finally, another way of understanding Deuteronomy is that it's an example of the testament, which is the final words of a dying patriarch were considered to have great power. They're 1 foot in the grave, 1 foot in the next world. Whatever they say, whoever they bless, whoever they curse, that's it. Yeah, they're sort of in touch with the divine. So the idea of the testament of the 12 patriarchs, the testament of Moses and so on, these became very powerful literary forms in Second Temple Judaism. Okay, so going back to my friend Thomas Thompson, whose work I obviously respect and find helpful. This is actually, we covered this already, I guess, with his traditional complex chain narrative. And we saw how he's applied that to Exodus 1 to 15, and we looked at that earlier when we're looking at some of the other material. So you get an initial triplet which sets up the story, puts the scene, introduces the key dilemma and hints at the solution. You get a series of traditional episodes that have been woven together a particular way by the author, and then something at the end that celebrates the successful outcome. Now you can, Thompson himself has applied that to everything from Genesis 1 through to Exodus 15, looking at different sort of toledot structures as examples of a traditional complex chain narrative. And subsequently, and not in published work, but just in my own work and teaching, I've applied the same literary genre to some of the other material in Joshua and 1 Samuel and so on. And it seems to me there's a really good case that you can see here at least a way in which an ancient Hebrew Israelite storyteller could create something new while using traditional material. Now, of course, once that is happening, then it makes it almost impossible for us to use source criticism and form criticism to date the content, because the content will be much older than the extant literary form in which we access it. Okay. Redaction criticism in terms of Exodus through Numbers, Deuteronomy. It's all bets off at the moment in terms of the redaction history of the Pentateuch and the composition history of the Pentateuch. From being one of the most assured results of biblical scholarship, it's become one of the most contested areas of biblical scholarship in the last 20 or so years. Generally speaking, the sort of D hypothesis, the hypothesis about the role of a Deuteronomistic redactor around the time of King Josiah, somewhere around about 625, thereabouts, the final decades of the First Temple period, that's pretty well survived intact because we have the book of Deuteronomy, and we have the next 4 books, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, which clearly have Deuteronomistic redactional activity going on. So that part is intact. The problematic area is how do we explain Genesis to Numbers? Where did that come from? Who wrote it? What were they doing? Okay, so one of the explanations around is that the Genesis to Numbers was written as a prelude to the Deuteronomistic history. Okay, so although we read Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, that it could have been Deuteronomy to Kings first, and then later the composition of Genesis to Numbers. Okay. The other factor in there is that one of the reasons for explaining how Deuteronomy goes with the Pentateuch and not with the other books in the canon is that 2 things. The content of Deuteronomy aligns it as one of the books of Moses. and it's Moses' final words. They're still in the wilderness, they haven't yet come into the promised land, all that sort of stuff. So in terms of content and key characters and location, Deuteronomy belongs with Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. In a very realpolitik kind of way, if you're in the Persian Empire, it'll be politic to stop at the end of Deuteronomy. Because Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings is about taking over the land and setting up your own country and not paying taxes to anyone, thank you very much. And the Persians are not going to be too keen on that kind of material getting a wide distribution. So, because Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings is how you take possession of the land, how you develop your own leadership, how you build your own temple, and even establish your own little mini empire. That's not going to go well in the Persian Empire. So there's another kind of perhaps historical, political reason why Deuteronomy would be treasured as the final summing up of the best of Moses. Put it out with the Pentateuch, as it were, says the publisher, and let's just leave that other stuff for some other time. We won't. That's really not where we're at in the present situation. So, in terms of redaction criticism and composition history, Deuteronomy has survived as a sort of late 7th century product. The issue then is, where did the non-Deuteronomic material come from, and to whom do we assign the most creative work, the Yahwist or the priestly collectors? Are they different, or are they just the same people? And are they writing in the Persian period or the Hellenistic period? And there are debates swirling around that. Now, a lot of that debate will not be reflected in the textbooks because it's still very recent, very contemporary stuff. It's happening more in the journals and the online blogs and so on. Okay. Then this is it's one of the most boring books actually to read, but it's also a really good book. It's a textbook for the class on Pentateuch. It's 8 years old now, but he at great detail, way more detail than anybody really wants to experience. Jean-Louis Scar kind of reviews the history of Pentateuchal scholarship, and he goes back through some of the basic data and source critical stuff and literary critical stuff before proposing his own explanation for the origins of the Pentateuch. And he uses the metaphor of a community which has returned to their ancestral land and is rebuilding a ruined city. Okay? Which of course is a common Middle Eastern dynamic. They'll be doing it soon in Aleppo and other Mosul and other places when the conflict finally stops. So what do you do? Well, you partly clear the site and get rid of stuff, but any rubble, any building materials which is reusable, you reuse. So he has this metaphor of the sort of Pentateuch being a reconstruction of Israel's sacred story, or telling a story, that it's like building a new house using recycled material, which then means, well, that's the window from a Federation house, and that's a double door from a 1960s house, and that's a hopper window, and so you get this mishmash of different bits and pieces. So you get a new city on the same location using pre-loved materials. And that's his metaphor for the Pentateuch. It means that it's difficult to date and interpret the component elements because they're no longer in their original context, they're no longer in their original configuration. But it also means if we keep worrying ourselves about where did that window come from, we may miss the integrity of the house, of the building. And so while in many ways, Scar is an old-fashioned historical critic, he's also very conscious of the existing final literary shape is what we need to pay attention to. And for sure there is texturing. For sure there are layers of tradition. There are sources, there are redactional pieces, and we may never unravel it. Okay? But let's enjoy the final product rather than getting anxious over the earlier components. So that's kind of the state of play in terms of source and redaction criticism stuff to do with Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. In terms of historical social science data, well, the information covered by this material particularly if you extend it through into Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, we're looking at traditions over more than 1,000 years. Okay? We're looking about traditions of Israel in Egypt, just starting from Exodus. You've got the traditions of Israel in the Sinai wilderness. You've got the stories, traditions about the conquest of Palestine by the Israelite tribes. You've got the traditions about tribal leadership prior to the emergence of strong central monarchical governance. And then you've got traditions about the Kingdom of Israel in the north, what is now the West Bank, and the Kingdom of Judah in the south, around Jerusalem. So you've got lots of historical and quasi-historical references there. I mean, Egypt, we have historical data for Egypt going back to the 4th millennium BCE. So then one of the challenges become, where does this Israel dimension fit into Egyptian history? Particularly given that the boundaries of Egypt could be the Sea of Galilee. You know, what does all this mean? And then we have the issues with regional empires, including Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, the Hellenistic rulers, and of course, after that, power of Rome. So there's all this data. So we're in a space where we know something about the neighbourhood. We know something about the thugs in the neighbourhood. We know something about the street art and the architecture and so on of the neighbourhood. The challenge is, where do these Old Testament traditions fit within what we know, or what we think we know about, you know, the eastern end of the Mediterranean between about 1500 and 500 BCE. So this takes us to the question of history and the Pentateuch, or history and the Torah. So on the internal chronology of the Bible, the stories in the Pentateuch would stretch between 1800 and 1200 BCE. That's just the Pentateuch, not Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. Okay? So Abraham would be dated around about 1800, and Moses would be dated around about 1280, and then Joshua and so on closer to 1200. And that fits with the Merneptah stele, a victory stela put up by the pharaoh Merneptah, in which he claims to have destroyed Israel. Okay, but Israel is not in hieroglyphics. Israel is not represented as a country, but as a group of people. So there's an interesting little twist in there as well. So Israel is appearing in historical documents for the first time, but not as a place, but as a people who are more like gypsies, if you like, than it's like Romani versus Romania. Yeah, what are we talking about when the first reference to Israel? Critical scholars, surprise, surprise, question whether these stories in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy reflect actual events happening, 1300, 1400, 1200 and so on, BCE. The traditions preserved here, as we've seen with source criticism and so on, are older than the books of the Torah, but how much older, and to what extent are they based on historical kind of data? And certainly the extant form, the books of the Pentateuch as we have them, can be no earlier than 500 BCE and possibly as late as 300 BCE, which is only a 200-year window when all things are considered. Okay. So again, this is not the time or the kind of class to go into trying to date or challenge the dating of the Exodus or the conquest and so on. Suffice to say, there are all different models and theories floating around, ranging from the Exodus really did happen, except they actually were going to Saudi Arabia, not to the Sinai Peninsula, and there are people who swear on a stack of Bibles that they found chariot wheels just off the coast of Saudi Arabia, where Pharaoh's army was cast into the sea, because it could have been a shipwreck where they threw off a load of chariots before they sank somewhere else. And so people will clutch onto data which supports whatever is their already preferred position.
We were in Ethiopia, and they say
Oh, well, they've got it as well,
we
yeah.
went to Axum,
Yeah.
and they firmly, resolutely, like you're saying, I don't know how it happened, but it happened.
Yeah.
You could not
Yeah.
make a waiver that the Ark
Yeah.
of the Covenant was there and had been there.
Yeah.
It's just,
Yeah.
it's interesting perspective.
Yeah, and that's the story they live by.
Yeah.
And that structures everything else.
And they accept that they don't know exactly, but
Yeah.
the truth for them is that
Yeah.
it's there.
And so it is inside that mud brick building or whatever.
Yeah, the church, they've built a church over it.
And they never bring it out for us to see it and photograph it, because that's the Western, show me the evidence, I'll take a picture. And no, that we're not going to do, not going to play that game. It's all a
No,
mystery.
they charge you $20 a building.
Of course. Come to Palestine and charge you more. Yeah, that's right. So in between the debate between minimalist and maximalist, there are all the local investments. And my friends in Nazareth and other colleagues, people I know in Bethlehem, their identity as Bethlehemites and Nazareth people is centered on the historicity of the Jesus stories in the New Testament. And it's fine for me to say as a historian, Jesus was born in Nazareth. Well, the Nazareth people are not grateful for that. Okay, they've got a good enough thing to work with already, and they don't want to upset their cousins in Bethlehem. And the people in Bethlehem absolutely do not want to buy the idea that Jesus was never a Bethlehem kid. Okay, so there's an investment in the story which is not in the least bit interested in the modern Western historical critical questions, and that's fine. And that's part of the kind of delicate path I walk as somebody with lots of friends who are Palestinian Christians. Okay, how do I navigate that between my critical and minimalist perspective and their devout perspective? Like one of my really dear friends, we were out driving one time and we were about to leave, and he recently gave me across a little sachet of white powder. No, not that sort of white powder. At least I don't think it was that sort of white powder. Turn the camera on. He said, I want you to have this, Father. Because over there I'm a Boona Greg. So he wanted me to have this. And this is some of the dried milk from the Blessed Virgin Mary on the rock in the cave church in Bethlehem, where she was feeding the baby Jesus as they were escaping to Egypt. Some of the milk projected past Jesus' mouth and landed on the rock. And this is some of that dried milk. And he wanted me to have it. Okay? Now you can probably guess where I'm coming from as a minimalist, historical, critical person, and so on. But, that to me is a very sacred moment. Okay? Not that I for a moment think it's the dried milk expressed or accidentally spilt by the Blessed Virgin in the cave with the spider and all the rest. But it's something I treasure. Yeah. One day my children will build a church over it and charge people to come in. And they won't let women in, yeah, that's right. Oh, I got it. Okay, so let's move to the world within the text. So now we're going to be focused within Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers and Deuteronomy. What is some of the way it hangs together in literary terms as distinct from historical, compositional terms. So the overriding thing for Exodus through Numbers is this idea of the tribes of Yahweh. They're becoming the people of Israel, but at this stage they're really the tribes of Yahweh. Okay? A loose confederation or a loose collection of tribal entities that have various stories about their ancestors and so on, and eventually will align their family stories so that Abraham is the daddy of them all and Isaac is the next one and Jacob is the next one. But if there's any historicity here, they were probably independent patriarchal narratives which have been collated into a common family tree to give a sense of unity to the whole people. Okay, and 12 because of 12 months of the year and da-da-da-da-da. So whatever, but that's the overriding kind of structure here. So Exodus 1 to 15 is the liberation from Egypt. So it's the stories of the bondage, Moses, contest with Pharaoh, crossing of the Red Sea, and so on. And chapter 15 is the end of that. Then they go into the wilderness, and it's just one of those unfortunate things in language and history that the wilderness is the wilderness of Sin, S-I-N, and S-I-N happens to be the English word for sin. Okay, but it's not the wilderness of sin, it's the Sinai wilderness, and so it's the wilderness of Sin, but it's just an unfortunate, it wouldn't have that effect in German or French, but in English it's that, no, I went into the wilderness of sin. Then from Exodus 19 through to the end of Leviticus, they're camped at the foot of the mountain of God. So at the base of Mount Sinai, for the rest of Exodus, which is chapter 40, I think, and all of Leviticus, they don't move. Okay? So that's 600,000 men of fighting age, plus their women and children, and all their cattle and livestock. And miracles of miracles, they didn't leave a single piece of litter for the archaeologists to discover, despite spending 40 years walking around in the Sinai desert. Amazing. Sorry, my cynicism shows through sometimes. Numbers chapters 1 to 10, they're preparing to leave the wilderness and resume their journey. And the last half of Numbers, they're beginning to arrive at the edge of the Promised Land. So they're dealing with the Moabites and the Edomites and the Ammonites and so on. That's where you get the story of Balaam with his talking donkey and all the rest. Okay. So that's the literary shape of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and the centerpiece is the people of God gathered around the mountain of God while they receive the laws by which they will live. And it kind of interrupts the narrative, but it's the reason for the narrative. That everything that tells us who we are as a people, from a Jewish perspective, was given to us at Mount Sinai. And the narrative, the story, the shape of the text reflects that. Then we have the book of Deuteronomy, which is, as I've suggested, is very much about renewing the covenant. And what we have here is the first 4 chapters. There's a Reader's Digest, the story so far, chapters 1, 2, 3 of Deuteronomy. It's a kind of a quick summary of what's happened in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. Okay? And then we have an exhortation by Moses, the first of several. Then we have the words of Moses, Deuteronomy 5 to 30, and there's the first sermon, or the first address, the second address, and the third address. Deuteronomy 5 to 11, 12 to 28, and then 29 and 30. So this is the old man giving his final speech to the gathered children of Israel before he toddles off into the corner to die. Okay? And then the final wrap-up in Deuteronomy is that they're poised to enter the land. So everything's ready now for Joshua to take them on to conquer the land. So we have Moses' final instructions in chapter 31. Then we have the Song of Moses in chapter 32. And then we have the blessing of Moses in chapter 33. And then we have the narrative of the death of Moses in chapter 34. And it's one of those quaint stories where it's speaking in the third person about Moses going up the mountain and dying, and nobody was with him, and God buried him. Well, how do we know that? Well, because it's not a historical account. That's how we know it. It's a person telling a story, and so they don't stop to say, oh, hang on, in 2,000 years' time, some smarty-pants Western intellectual is going to want to know, what's my evidence for this? Okay? So Deuteronomy is all about Moses. It's celebrating the Moses tradition. Moses is the great lawgiver. And instead of going up the mountain to get the law, Moses is the people on the plains of Moab, and Moses is giving his final summing up of what it's all been about and how they conduct themselves. And it's all about loving God with all your heart and soul and mind, and it's also about strict covenantal faithfulness. Okay? So it's a very different way of telling the story from Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and the content is very different because it's not as focused on how to arrange sacrifices, how to organise vestments and so on, how to decorate the tabernacle and the temple, and yet it's teasing out the same basic covenant implications and celebrating the Mosaic covenant as the basis of Israel's identity. Okay. Any points for clarification? So what we're looking at here is what makes the stuff hang together as a piece of literature. How is it structured? Now, in the opinion of the source critics, chapter 12 to 28 is often thought to be the document that was found in the temple in 2 Kings 22.
Sorry, which one?
Chapters 12 to 28. At the time of Josiah is refurbishing or repairing the temple. What that means in historical terms was he was taking down the Assyrian flag and he was putting up the Jerusalem flag. Okay, and as part of that process, he removed the Assyrian idols from the temple, and basically his declaration of independence was to stop offering prayers for the Assyrian king and to only offer Jewish prayers to the Jewish God for the Jewish people. Okay? Because there's no separation of church and state. So the repairs to the temple is not just that he thought it needed a new coat of paint. Okay, he was realigning the politics of Jerusalem by changing the religious paraphernalia at the temple. And amongst the things he took out was the bronze serpent, Nehushtan, which had been on the temple wall since the time of Solomon. But Israelites don't have graven images. That's okay, because this is the bronze serpent that Moses put up on the stake in the wilderness, so it's okay. Well, that's not okay, and that's why Josiah took it out. Okay, but so behind that story, which is not in Exodus to Numbers, of course, is the reality that there's a tradition, a memory, that there were idols in the temple in Jerusalem. Right up until as late as Josiah, there were idols in the temple of Jerusalem. And so he's cleaning out the temple and he's implementing a new liturgical policy, which is very Presbyterian. No holy pictures, no incense, or we would have still had incense because it would smell too badly otherwise, because there's animal sacrifice and so on. But yeah, it's a fairly strict reform movement along Deuteronomistic principles. And what Josiah is doing reflects exactly the requirements of Deuteronomy, kaching. Okay? And so people say, so what was this? Because the story says that as they were repairing the temple, the guy in charge of the workers found a scroll of the law of God in the back room of the temple, and they brought it to the high priest, who took it to the king, who said, oh my goodness, we're all in deep doo-doos, we haven't been doing the right thing. And so he proclaimed it as the law which applied to Judah. In other words, he made that the constitution. So they adopted the Deuteronomistic regulations as the public document governing the life of the kingdom of Judah around about 622 BC. It's one of those rare datable moments in the history of religion. Okay, and so we think Deuteronomy 12 to 28, which is basically the guts of Deuteronomy, is probably the document that was found, inverted commas, in the temple in the year 622. Can we prove that? No, we can't, but there's a reasonable case that that's what's happening. Okay, I can see how excited you all are. Okay. All right. Okay, and then we'd ask the same sort of questions as we were talking about before. Okay. So within the literary world, not the historical world, not Josiah, not Moses, not Joshua, within the literary world of Exodus, Numbers, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, within the literary world of Deuteronomy, what's happening? And that's in fact what I was doing before. What's happening in Exodus, Numbers, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, is that the people of God are gathered around the mountain and they're being given all the laws and regulations which will govern their life together. And they're discovering their identity as the people of God. Now, this is a narrative way of doing it. In the prophetic literature, we'll find Ezekiel and others saying, you know, come back out to the wilderness so that I can woo you all over again and make you my bride. So this idea that if we could just go back to the wilderness, everything would be good. And we could sort out our relationship with God, have a second honeymoon, come back into town and move on with life. Now, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers is doing the same kind of thing as Amos and Hosea and Ezekiel, but it's doing it as narrative, whereas the prophetic books are doing it in different genre. But there's an underlying sense of covenant renewal and the wilderness as a kind of golden age, when life was simpler and there were less distractions and the kids behaved themselves, you know, all that sort of thing. So what's going on? Who are the key characters? Well, the key characters, of course, are Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. And it goes, again, because of language and translation, we miss the point here. Miriam, Mariamne, Mary, okay, same name. Joshua, Yeshua, Jesus, same name. Okay, so when the New Testament is telling stories about Joshua and Miriam, who we call Mary and Jesus, we're missing the connections, because in English we don't transliterate the names out of the Hebrew the same as we transliterate the names out of the Greek. Okay, but they are the same names coming up. Joseph the Dreamer in Matthew chapter 1. Okay, so there are all these little parallels and intertextual dynamics between the text as they stand, whether it's in the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Bible as a whole. When? Well, it's back in the wilderness time, back before we had kings, back before we were in the land, when we didn't have to worry about borders and fences and whose block of land is this to farm. You can't come down by this tree, my land is from this tree to that creek. You don't have those issues when you're sort of nomadic herders in the desert. Where? Well, it's in the Sinai Peninsula, with apologies to the Saudi theory people. And why, of course, which is the big question. What are they doing here? They're imagining who they could and should be as the people of God. And their way of imagining that is to think what it would have been like back when it was perfect. And if we could just get that back. And so they're visualizing their present and their future by talking about the past and setting up an ideal future. Okay? And we come blundering in and saying, yeah, but whereabouts did they camp? Why didn't they leave any cans lying around? Why can't, well, they didn't have cans, but why can't we see evidence of them having been here? We're asking entirely the wrong questions when we do that. The benefit of asking those questions is that it reminds us not to treat the text as primarily about history. The texts are primarily about vision, about imagining the kind of people we want to be. They're not primarily about what happened in the past. They're actually more about what's going to happen in the future. But they talk about the future under the guise of describing the past. That's my theory anyway. Okay, and then the world beyond the text. Soon my talkathon will be finished, which will be very nice. So, same sort of thing as we did before lunch, just a very brief slide to begin teasing out some of the dynamics that would apply when we start to ask the question, so how do these texts function in our world? Okay? We can do our best to understand the world out of which they emerged, and we can certainly do our best to try and understand the world within the text, but how might we claim these texts in our own world? So these will be some of the issues. One of the lines of issue, one set of issues will be around who gets the blessing, and that, of course, is still a very live political issue in Palestine right now between Israelis and Palestinians. Okay, who gets the blessing? Religion, identity, covenant. Our God has given this land to us, so rack off. Go somewhere else. And if you don't, we'll kill you. These days we call it ethnic cleansing, okay? But the Old Testament is full of ethnic cleansing, as is early Australian colonial history, of course, and North American colonial history as well. So we have historically, European Christians have read these stories, including Joshua Judges, as permission to kill and ethnically cleanse the indigenous populations of any land we wish to claim for ourselves.
Was it their soul claim though? Was it not as a consequence of the Holocaust?
No.
Nothing?
The Zionists, you're talking about modern Israel?
Yeah.
No, the modern Zionist project predates the Second World War. It goes back to the late 19th century. And if anything, it was driven, so Jewish Zionism is actually a product of Christian Zionism, which had decided on its own reading of the text that Jesus would not come back until the Jewish people were restored to the land of Palestine. Okay, and so influential British people, including Shaftesbury, Lord Shaftesbury and others, took it upon themselves to what was called Jewish restorationism, to get the Jewish people back into Israel, to the land of Israel, so that Jesus could come back and the world would be over. And in their politics of 19th century Britain, that was seen as the divine mandate for the British people That was our contribution to human history to bring about the second coming. I mean, it's an amazing. I teach a master's course occasionally on apocalypse then and now, and we look at sort of Christian Zionism and the emergence of Jewish Zionism, the formation of the World Zionist Council in 1896, Theodor Herzl, and then the British Mandate period and so on. So the events of the Holocaust reinforced the Jewish people's sense of urgency about a homeland. But up until then, the majority, and even directly after the Second World War, most Jews in North America, for instance, were not in any sense in favour of a Jewish state in Palestine. They thought they were crazies. So it's a very mixed dynamic these days. But we've got these rival claims to the blessing, from as tangible as something as Hebron, town of 100,000 Arabs and 300 Jews. You will give it to us because it used to be Abraham's town. Well, Abraham didn't actually exist, but never mind. Give us the town. We want it. And we've got bigger guns than you, so we will have it. And that's how it is. That's what will happen. Okay? For 100 years or so. And then the Iranian missiles will arrive and it'll be a different story. So it's the Crusades. I suspect it's the Crusades all over again, but with a different set of people with a dream. This time it's the Jewish people on a crusade to retake Jerusalem. And my personal view is that Judaism has actually sold its soul with Zionism. For the sake of a claim to the land, a physical claim to the land, they're losing their prophetic heritage, their prophetic voice. Many of my Jewish friends don't like my opinion on that particular point, but my Palestinian friends do. Okay, but it also goes to questions like, who's the son of Abraham who's blessed? Is it Ishmael or Isaac? And if you're doing Genesis 22, that's one of the issues. There are two very different versions of that story. Who is the child of blessing? Okay. So, who has the claim to blessing? Who have the claims to the land? It raises questions, we've already been doing this, questions about ethnic cleansing, religious violence. And this is not about pointing fingers at Israel, because actually the worst perpetrators of ethnic cleansing and religious violence have been European Christians, people like us, okay, who did not, most of the earlier white settlers did not think that Indigenous Australians were human beings. Fortunately, some of the early evangelical Christian leaders said, these are people with souls. We should put them into missions and convert them and try and save them. Otherwise, we would have just wiped them out. And we almost did. So it's not a case of pointing fingers at Israel, because the majority of the ethnic cleansing and religious violence has not been Muslims attacking the West. It's been the Christian West thinking we have the right to go all around the world and just take it over in the name of God and King. Then there's issues around slavery and the treatment of aliens. Read asylum seekers. Okay. Yes, the Old Testament, like everything else in the ancient world, accepted and regulated the institution of slavery, but they also had traditions of hospitality and compassion for resident aliens. And if you're doing the exercise on the Book of Ruth, at the heart of the Book of Ruth is the question of the resident alien. Okay? Your people will be my people, your God will be my God, and so wherever you go, I will go, wherever you die, I will die. Amazing stuff. Okay? So, of course, none of this is relevant to our situation in Australia. And then issues of gender and same-sex relationships and so on. How do we read these stories? How do we read the dynamics that are going on? If you get a chance to talk with Anthony Rees at some stage, one of the things who's here as a postdoctoral researcher this year, his PhD was on a particular chapter in the Book of Numbers. Not many people bother with the Book of Numbers. He's writing a commentary on Numbers for the Earth Bible series, but the particular chapter he focused on, and I can't remember the exact chapter now, but it's towards the end of Numbers, and some of this, because they're in that space where they get to enter the land, they're mingling with the Moabites and the Ammonites and the Edomites, And so sexual relationships begin to happen between the different tribes, and this is a no-no from the point of view of the Levitical priests. So the particular chapter that Anthony focused on was a story where there's an Israelite man who has a female partner who's from one of the local tribes, and they're actually engaged in sexual intercourse, and this fanatical priest comes in, spears them through, kills both of them with the one stroke. And as a result of this wonderful act of bravery and loyalty to Yahweh, he and his family are promised everlasting blessing and basically a Yahwistic pension for as long as Israel exists. Now, what do we do with texts like that? Okay. In what sense do we say this is the word of the Lord? Well, we basically just shut our eyes and look the other way. We don't read that in church. Surprise, surprise. Okay, and we certainly don't read it on a school assembly. Okay, that would be really interesting. So there are all sorts of dynamics in there about what a family is, what relationships are about, and so on, what it means to be a gendered person, which will shape the way we read and accept or engage with these texts. And then, of course, there's the earth perspective. And if we're looking at things like Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, with their emphasis on holiness and on purity, then how does that factor into the ecology debate, the environmental debate? What does it mean to treat the earth in such a way that we keep the earth pure rather than polluted? Okay, now, it's not that the Old Testament had a theory of nature. That concept didn't exist at the time. Okay, there's no explicit biblical teaching on environmental issues. That's a modern agenda. But if we read the Bible, if we read these texts from the perspective of earth, maybe it's part of our mission as humans under divine providence to be the voice for earth. We are earth articulating her concerns. Because if we don't articulate the concerns of earth, who will? If nobody does, we have no future. Now, that's not a set of issues which would have been in any way on the horizon 3,000 years ago. For a start, they couldn't destroy the earth with their own technology. Okay? Most of their hills still had trees on them, as the hills in Galilee did until 100 years ago, when they were chopped down to build railways for the Ottoman Empire, and deforestation became part of the reality in the Galilee. Okay? So what's the earth perspective in all this? And how does reading the scriptures, reading these stories which talk about being the covenant people, being faithful to God, being faithful to our neighbours, is not earth one of our neighbours? Is not earth more than a neighbour? So what's our 10th or 11th or 12th commandment in terms of the earth? If we can slip one in for honour your mother and father, perhaps we can slip one in for honour Mother Earth. Okay, and then of course there are issues about relations with Judaism and Islam, and depending where you are in the world and so on, these will have various amounts. They'll take different forms. In Australia, it's all very polite and so on. But if you're living in the Middle East, particularly if you're a Christian Arab living in Israel or the West Bank, then they take there's a particular edge to these sorts of conversations. For instance, just in the last 2 weeks, the Israeli Knesset has passed a law saying that Christian Arabs are not Arabs. They're Christians, not Arabs, and therefore they can be called up to serve in the Israeli Defence Force. Okay, whereas Muslim Arabs are exempt from being called up to serve in the IDF. Okay, now it's a blatant attempt to separate Christian Palestinians from Muslim Palestinians, and in the process weaken the Palestinian civil society, because Christian Palestinians tend to be better educated, tend to be more professional class, because they're also more westernized. So you not only divide and conquer, but you actually take out the most articulate voices from the Palestinian community if you can isolate Christians from Muslims. Now, to me, that's an issue about how do we read the text together as Jews, Muslims, and Christians. Okay? So this stuff is not just about things that happened or didn't happen, whatever, 3,000 years ago. This is about how we read these sacred texts with an eye to what's happening in the newspaper. neither what's happening in our school campus. Okay, I think that is it for now. So